Has anyone ever been to a wedding where someone actually objected? And if so, how did that go? Story 1. Groom found out that the bride was cheating 2 days before the wedding day. He spilled the beans while exchanging the vows. That's such a position to be in. You plan this event to celebrate finding your life mate, find out it wasn't real, and you're still on the hook for it financially. Your only solace is to embarrass her in front of everyone, but also embarrass yourself in front of your loved ones with such a spectacle of being cheated on. It's embarrassing to make a spectacle of it in front of all of your loved ones. I can't imagine everybody clapping and having a big old party afterwards. It's like watching a couple have their worst fight possible, but all of their family and friends are watching. You're right though, getting cheated isn't embarrassing. You didn't do anything wrong. Story 2. There was a Redditor who was the bride in her wedding, and she discovered that her groom was cheating on her. She took Reddit's suggestion that she slide in a photograph of them together into the rotating montages at the pre-ceremony. She did that and bailed on the rest of the wedding ceremony. Story 3. In my mid-20s, I dated someone I knew from HS. She didn't know me. I was a geek. She was a theater nerd. Met through mutual friends at a pub. First date, she regaled me with the tale of leaving her fiancé. They'd been living together. She found out he was cheating. She was the last in her circle to find out. With the help of her friends, she moved out while he was at work, and most of their stuff belonged to her. So their place was pretty much lacking once the truck rolled out. Story 4. Kind of. My uncle was getting married. Small, just a handful of family and a minister. I was videotaping. My grandmother was not into it at all. With each line spoken by the minister, she had a cutting, sarcastic response. I could not believe it. It was so unlike her. When that part came up, she said, "I object, but does it really matter? They are going to do it anyway." The minister just ignored her and proceeded business as usual. They were divorced within a year. Wish I had a copy. Story 5. I had a friend who was a minister, and the subject came up if he asked the question during ceremonies he officiated. He laughed and said no way. He basically tells the couple not to include it because it only invites a moment of anxiety at best, misery at worst. His best story, and one of the reasons he stopped including the question, was a couple where the lead up to the wedding, the couple was obviously in love. The bride was very smiley and happy. Day of the wedding, she's stone-faced. He knows something is up because he's never seen her like this, and he asks if she's okay. "I'm fine." Right before the service, he asks again. "I'm fine." He gets to the question, "Does anyone object to this union?" The bride reaches over, grabs the maid of honor, shoves her into the bride's spot, and says, "You're screwing him, you marry him," and then stormed out of the church. Slightly different circumstances, but I know a guy that was the videographer at a wedding where the groom was the one that objected to the wedding at that point. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the groom broke down crying and said that he couldn't go through with the wedding. Apparently, he had gotten a stripper pregnant and felt like he had to marry the stripper instead of the bride. He got pulled into a side room by the officiant, his father, and the father of the bride, while everyone else, including the bride, stood around awkwardly. A few minutes later, the father of the bride came out and told everyone that the ceremony was over and the wedding was off, but that everyone was welcome to go to the reception and enjoy the food. My friend didn't stick around for the reception, so I have no idea how it all turned out, but apparently the bride was understandably not taking it well. Story 6. I was at one where the groom thanked the bride's ex for dying as his loss was my gain. Didn't help the sons of his bride and ex were in attendance. Story 7. A friend of mine has a band that plays lots of weddings and other parties. They were hired for a birthday party that turned out to be a surprise wedding. The guy surprised his GSF with a proposal and wanted to have a wedding ceremony then and there. She said no and left. Story 8. My auntie's fiancé was already married. The lady stood up waving the marriage certificate. So the wedding didn't go ahead. The reception was on a long boat, so we still went to that. The fiancé went back to home country to sort it out and never came back. Story 13. One of my cousins is married to literally one of the kindest and coolest dudes I have ever met. Before the wedding, her little sister was saying how she's marrying my best friend. At the wedding, when the priest asks if anyone objects, the room is dead quiet and all you hear is a little girlish whisper, "I do." It was honestly really adorable and we all laughed. And my cousin's husband and her little sister are still best friends. Story 14. At his rehearsal dinner, a co-worker's mother's toast included that his soon-to-be wife was a damn dirty whore who wasn't good enough for her son. Folks are not happy. Video ended, so I didn't see the whole thing. At the wedding which I attended, his mom started to say something at the speak now part, but was silenced by her daughter. Mom left and didn't see the rest of the ceremony. Everything about that poor guy was drama. Story 15. I don't know if it's a UK thing or even just a one specific church thing, but I was told by the priest in a rehearsal that if someone objects, even as a joke, the priest is required to pause the ceremony and talk to the objector alone to discuss their concerns and decide if they have a valid objection. Like, it's not a fun jokey moment, it's a real legal part of the ceremony. He also said it used to be custom that if you raised an invalid objection, you then had to pay for the wedding. Story 16. Went to a wedding where they skipped that part because the bride's adult daughter was planning to object. I feel like about half of weddings these days don't have that part, and not because of feared objections, just because it is outdated and weird. Premarital sex is a thing. Divorce is a thing. Weddings cost like over $10K. If you know reasons to stop a marriage, outside of movies, you need to intervene at the engagement or earlier, not during the ceremony. That said, one of my wife's college roommates canceled a wedding like a day or 2 days beforehand, right after graduating college, after being in a long-distance relationship with some guy for a year or so. Her family was quite well off, and she was dating a guy who lavished gifts and expensive dates on her whenever they were together. Said he ran his own company, just bought a fancy house, etc. It turns out he was just super in debt, working a near minimum wage job and maxing out credit cards taken out fraudulently. He had a fake web page with other employees for his company that he set up for the sole purpose of keeping up the front. The house was only bought from grossly lying about income, pre-2007 housing crisis, on the mortgage application, and he was drowning in debt. The almost bride's father got bad vibes about the guy. A few things didn't add up, like he had this fancy house but couldn't afford any furniture, and he hired a PI who quickly uncovered the deception. And she didn't break up because he wasn't rich. She broke up because he spent tons of effort to lie about everything and was completely conning her and just trying to get her roped into joint ownership of his debt via marriage that he expected the family to pay off. Story 17. Not at a wedding, but at a funeral, someone objected to the death. At my uncle's funeral, his ex-wife and a local church cult leader tried to raise him from the dead. We were all sitting there like normal people at a normal funeral, and she walks up to the casket and starts yelling, "James Lester, raise up!" I didn't know she was there, or I would have prepared myself for shenanigans. Also, I didn't know my uncle's middle name was Lester, so please imagine the confusion. So she and the cult leader are literally yelling at my uncle's body. Not surprisingly, my uncle refused to resurrect himself. They were escorted out. I've actually never told this story because it makes my family look insane. Story 18. Yes, at my cousin's, the bride's ex showed up, and when he stood up to object, my uncles grabbed him and bum rushed him out of the church and gave him a tune-up in the parking lot. Catholic wedding, of course. Story 19. I went to a Catholic wedding where, when the priest asked this question, one of the groomsmen did a very loud, long throat clearing, which got everyone laughing. Everyone except for the bride's elderly Italian grandmother, who marched out of her seat and angrily hit the groomsman with her handbag and shouted at him in Italian. Story 20. My mother passed away about 15 years ago. 5 years later, my dad married my now stepmother. It was an outdoor wedding on a beautiful sunny day, and during the spot where they usually ask if anyone objects, a big gust of wind came out of nowhere and knocked over some tables. Afterward, multiple people came to tell me that wind gust was my mother objecting, which I like to believe was true. Experienced the somewhat opposite of this at my own wedding. It took place during late summer at a time that is generally sunny and warm, but, of course, it happens during our wedding that the weather was abnormally poor. Cloudy, cold, and all that. We had, of course, decided that our ceremony was outside, no less. My wife's father passed away some years ago, and I never had the chance to meet him. The fact that he was gone was naturally, once again, an emotional subject now that she was getting married. During our ceremony, however, right when we were saying our I do's, the clouds parted and the sun started shining. Needless to say, many guests came to the same conclusion, and I also like to believe it was true. Sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but it's our real-life fairy tale, and even writing about it still hits pretty hard. Story 21. A relative visited one ceremony where it was asked if anyone objects, and the groom decided it's a good time for a joke and said, "I do." The lady who was going to marry the couple just turned and left. They had to go through all the paperwork again and change the date. Got married, divorced in like 3 years if I remember correctly. Story 22. My grandmother objected to my sister's wedding. My sister was a Florida-based Italian Catholic and somewhat conservative individual who fell in love with a progressive New York Jew. My nonna said it wouldn't work and it would change one of them, and she was worried about it changing her granddaughter. My parents managed to get her away from the wedding, and it continued. My sister is now neither Catholic or conservative, so my nonna was absolutely right. Story 23. I was the best man at my bestie's wedding. Someone that we tolerated in our friend group objected and said he was in love with the bride and that he was the only one that could make her happy. She had been nice about his feelings until then and reminded him in front of the entire ceremony that A, he couldn't hold down a job because he had too big of an ego. B, didn't get along with her friends because they all had something they were working on. A book, a career, a trip, volunteer job. And he had nothing, so he constantly tried to downplay their accomplishments on purely presumptuous ideas. And C, his idea of sex was, blow me and I'll finger you, night hun. She was way more thorough and more cruel. and it was a hysterical 5-minute ordeal. I mean, he had it coming, or starting shit at her wedding. He got up and left. I was pretty sure he was crying as he walked away, but no one went after him. It was both brutal and hilarious. He was like the Jar Jar Binks of our friend group. You hated him, but he made you feel better because at least you weren't as bad as Peter. Story 24. The mom of one of the bridesmaids got up and yelled, "Yeah, I object. You fucking stole him from her," while pointing at the bride. I've known the groom for a long time, and by proxy the bride. I am still very good friends with them. I have never seen her more interested than at that moment. The bridesmaid got up from her chair and was like, "I'm so sorry. Let me get her out of here." The bridesmaid and the bride's stepfather escorted the woman out of the wedding, and it continued. Story 25. My mom told me she was going to pay an old boyfriend to stand up and object at my wedding. She didn't in the end, but I did cast a quick look around in the church before walking down the aisle. My mother-in-law actually brought my wife's ex to our wedding in hopes that my wife would see him and leave me. She didn't really care other than being mad at her mom. I talked to the guy after the wedding and thanked him for coming just to be polite. He told me that I wasn't good enough. This was a message my mill had sent a number of times, so it didn't really catch me off guard. I grabbed and shook his hand, smiled, and I told him he was a fucking creep for coming uninvited to a wedding of his ex from 10 years ago. Then I invited him to enjoy some refreshments during the cocktail hour and walked away. My wife gets mad about the not good enough comment and has him and her mother removed from the reception. He and my MIL are still close, and she still invites him over on major holidays. I'm younger than my wife by 3.5 years, and my first impression of the guy was hearing him ask my FL how he felt about his daughter marrying a child, so I pretty much wrote him off as an asshole from day one. My Mael permanently hurt her relationship with her daughter that day, and we didn't see her for close to a year after the wedding.